The first time they saw the English sails, the sea looked wrong to pale, to calm like it was holding its breath. Along the sandbars of Patuxet, where the wind tasted of salt and pine, the Wampanoag fishermen stopped mid-cast and stared as if the horizon had opened a wound. Some elders whispered that the ocean was returning what it had swallowed. Others said it was only wood and cloth nothing. A people of forests and rivers should fear. But fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives as hope. When the English finally stepped onto the cold shoreline of Cape Cod Bay, they did not come with war cries. They came with hollow cheeks, shaking hands, and a hunger so desperate it looked almost innocent. The Wampanoag watched them stumble, watched them pray to a sky that did not answer in their language. And in that weakness, a dangerous thought took shape. If they are this fragile, we can control the risk, we can trade, we can guide them, we can keep them from becoming enemy. That was the first bargain made, not with ink, but with compassion. Sassaman Young, sharp-eyed, eager to believe in a future without constant blood, dead became the bridge between worlds. Metacom, the war-minded son of a great sachem, felt the ground ift under their feet, and pretended he didn't. And Wamset, older, quieter, carried the memory of sickness that had already emptied villages like a tide pulling bodies back into the dark. The English called it friendship. The Wampanoag called it breathing space. But every gift has a shadow. Every handshake hides a blade if, not now, then later. And years from that shoreline, when the forests of Plymouth Colony echoed with gunfire and the rivers ran black with ash, the Wampanoag would remember this moment, with a kind of horror that has no scream in it, only silence. And if you feel that silence tightening while you listen, don't ignore it. It's trying to warn you. The winter winds that swept across Cape Cod Bay did not care about treaties, gods, or promises. They moved through the skeletal trees of Patuxet and across the half-frozen marshes, with the same indifference they had always shown. Yet that winter felt different. The land itself seemed uncertain, as though it sensed that something irreversible had already begun. In the Wampanoag villages scattered between the forests and tidal rivers of what would later be called Massachusetts, people spoke in lower tones. They remembered the sickness that had come years before the English arrived, a plague carried invisibly through trade routes and coastal contact, emptying entire communities before anyone could understand its origin. Fields had grown wild. Sacred places had become silent. Trust, once natural as breathing, had become something measured carefully, like grain in a near-empty storehouse. Massasoit, us. Amikwin, the grand sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy, carried that memory like a weight across his shoulders. He understood the fragile balance of power along the northeastern coast. To the south and west, rival tribes watched for weakness. To the north, shifting alliances could change with the season. When the English settlers of Plymouth Colony struggled to survive their first brutal winter in 1622-1621, Massasoit saw not just starving foreigners, but a political equation. An alliance could mean weapons, trade goods, and a counterweight against enemies. Refusal could mean desperation turning into aggression. Every choice felt like walking along thin ice over deep, unseen water. For young Sassaman, who had learned fragments of English speech and watched the newcomers with curiosity instead of hatred, the arrival of the settlers stirred conflicting emotions. He saw their fear when the snow thickened and their crops failed. He heard their coughing in the night air and noticed how they clutched metal tools like talismans. They did not look like conquerors then. They looked lost. And something inside him, part compassion, part ambition, whispered that he could become essential to both worlds if he could speak for them and for his own people. Perhaps he could prevent bloodshed before it ever began. Wamsuta, Massasoit's eldest son, observed the same scenes with heavier eyes. He trusted patterns, not appearances. The English built fences even before they built understanding. They marked land with lines and claimed ownership over soil that had never belonged to a single hand. Wamsuta watched them cut timber without ceremony and dig into earth without offering thanks. He wondered whether a people who treated land as possession rather than relative could ever truly share it. Yet he also saw their muskets and understood their value. Survival, he knew, sometimes required swallowing doubt. Metacom, younger and more inwardly restless, felt something colder than doubt. He walked the shoreline at dusk, studying the anchored ships that creaked like living creatures in the harbor. The sound unsettled him. It felt like a heartbeat not belonging to the land. While elders debated diplomacy, Metacom imagined futures shaped by iron and fire. He feared that each act of generosity, each basket of corn given freely, each lesson in planting and fishing was planting seeds that would grow beyond anyone's control. But he remained silent, knowing that open resistance would fracture unity when unity was already fragile. The first treaty between Massasoit and the English in 1621 was spoken of as mutual protection. It promised peace, trade, and military support if either side were attacked. To the settlers, it was a miracle of survival. To the Wampanoag, it was strategy wrapped in cautious optimism. The shared harvest feast, later romanticized as the first Thanksgiving, carried layers of tension beneath its surface. While venison roasted and corn was passed between hands, no one could fully forget that alliance born of necessity is not the same as trust born of kinship. Even in celebration, eyes measured distance. As seasons turned, trade flourished. Metal tools replaced stone in certain tasks. Muskets altered hunting patterns. English livestock wandered into native fields, trampling crops that had fed families for generations. Small disagreements were smoothed over, at first handled through interpreters and gestures of goodwill. But with every passing year, more ships arrived, more settlers built homes. The fragile arithmetic that once favored coexistence began tilting quietly, almost imperceptibly. The Wampanoag noticed the change not as a sudden storm, but as a steady pressure like the tide, rising higher than usual against familiar rocks. And yet, despite unease, hope persisted. Hope that cooperation could prevent war. Hope that shared enemies would keep alliances intact. Hope that promises spoken in good faith would remain binding even as power shifted. That hope would become the most dangerous element of all, not because it was foolish, but because it was human. Before the forests would burn and the rivers would carry the echo of musket fire, before names like Wamsuta and Metacom would be spoken with grief, instead of pride, there was this moment, a pause between worlds, where trust still seemed possible and the price of it had not yet been revealed. Spring came softly to the lands around Mount Hope Bay, where salt marshes breathed with the tide and oak forests stretched. Inland toward the rolling hills of present-day Bristol, Rhode Island, the Wampanoag villages stirred with cautious renewal. Children gathered shellfish along the muddy flats, women prepared the earth for planting, and warriors moved quietly through familiar hunting paths. Yet something invisible had shifted. The English settlements in Plymouth were no longer fragile clusters of desperate survivors. Timber houses stood firmer now. Fences expanded, fields carved deeper into the forest. What once seemed temporary had begun to root itself into permanence. Sassaman felt that permanence most sharply. He had spent increasing time among the English, listening to their sermons, observing their rigid prayers and their written words scratched onto parchment. He admired the power of writing, the way memory could be fixed, arguments preserved beyond a single voice. At times, he believed that understanding them would protect his people, but EACH visit to Plymouth left him unsettled. He noticed how settlers spoke of land as something granted by divine right, something to be subdued and owned. They rarely spoke of it as alive. That difference lingered in his mind like a crack forming in ice. Wamsuta, now carrying more responsibility as Massasoit aged, attempted to maintain balance. He attended meetings where English leaders requested additional territory, often framing it as harmless expansion. Their words were polite, their tone reasonable. They offered goods, assurances, and sometimes silver. Yet Wamsuta sensed urgency beneath their calm. Their population was growing, and with growth came hunger for soil, for timber, for control. He agreed to certain exchanges, believing he could manage the pace of change. Each concession felt small on its own. Together, they formed a pattern he could not ignore. Metacom walked the boundary lines more often now, studying the edges where forest met fence. He watched English cattle graze into Wampanoag planting grounds, and listened as settlers dismissed complaints as misunderstandings. To Metacom, these were not accidents, they were tests. Each unchallenged intrusion taught the settlers how far they could push. He felt anger rising, but also doubt. If he spoke too harshly, would he be blamed for breaking the peace their father had fought to secure? If he stayed silent, would he be complicit in something larger than he could yet name? Meanwhile, English confidence deepened. They interpreted the alliance as validation of their mission. Proof that even the natives, as they called them, recognized their divine purpose. Ministers preached about providence, while surveyors measured new plots of land. The Wampanoag were often described as allies, but rarely as equals. Sassaman heard these sermons and felt a chill despite the warmth of spring air. He began to understand that gratitude could transform into entitlement with frightening speed. What had begun as mutual dependence was slowly becoming imbalance. The forests themselves seemed to carry witness. Ancient trees fell to axes, their rings exposing centuries of quiet growth. Rivers that once reflected only sky and leaf now mirrored rooftops and smoke. Wampanoag hunters found game retreating deeper inland. Sacred spaces grew, harder to access without crossing newly claimed property. These changes did not explode into violence. They seeped into daily life, altering it grain by grain. The tribe adapted where it could, adjusting routes, negotiating boundaries, reminding themselves that peace still existed. Yet beneath adaptation lay a tension that no treaty could fully contain. The English legal system began asserting authority over disputes involving both peoples. Incidents that once would have been resolved through Wampanoag custom were now judged by colonial courts. Sassaman sensed the danger immediately. Law, he realized, was another kind of weapon, one that required no musket. When rules are written in a language only one side controls, justice becomes fragile. He tried to warn others quietly, but hope still held sway in many hearts. And so the alliance endured, outwardly intact, even as cracks widened beneath its surface. The Wampanoag had trusted in strategy, in patience, in the belief that coexistence could be managed through wisdom and restraint. They did not yet see how trust, once given, can be used as leverage. They did not yet feel how slowly a balance can tip until it becomes impossible to restore. But the air around Mount Hope carried a weight, now subtle, persistent, waiting for something to push it past the point of return. Summer settled heavily over the woodlands near Eles, the ancestral seat of Massasoit, along the shores of present-day Barrington, Rhode Island. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, and dragonflies hovered above reeds that whispered in the breeze. Outwardly, life followed familiar rhythms, planting, fishing, repairing canoes worn by tide and time. Yet beneath that rhythm, conversations had sharpened. The English were no longer simply neighbors. They were an expanding presence, pushing beyond Plymouth into new settlements like Taunton and edging closer to Wampanoag territories, with survey maps and muskets carried as casually as walking sticks. Wamsuta, now increasingly acting in his father's stead, traveled to meet colonial officials who summoned him under the language of diplomacy. Each meeting felt less like partnership and more like interrogation. They asked him to reaffirm land sales his father had agreed 2 years earlier, questioning whether those agreements were truly binding. Wamsuta felt insult coil inside him. Were their words never enough? Were their marks and gestures insufficient proof? He sensed that the English did not merely want cooperation, they wanted submission disguised as legality. Sassaman stood in the uneasy middle. Having spent time among the English, he understood their insistence on documentation, on written confirmation of every exchange. He tried to explain this to his people, even as part of him resented it. Writing, once fascinating, now felt like a tool reshaping reality itself. If land could be described on parchment, then it could be owned in ways that ignored memory and ancestry. He began to feel the cost of his dual role. To the English, he was useful. To some of his own people, he was suspected too comfortable among those who cut forests without ceremony. Metacom observed these developments with tightening resolve. He saw how English livestock multiplied and how fences advanced into hunting grounds near the Nemusket River. He noticed how younger Wampanoag men reacted not with the patience of elders, but with simmering frustration. They had grown up during the alliance. They had not witnessed the same desperation that had led Massasoit to seek English friendship. To them, the settlers' growing demands felt less like necessity and more like betrayal. Metacom understood their anger because it mirrored his own. Tensions deepened when rumors spread that English courts might claim authority over Wampanoag leaders themselves. The idea struck like a sudden storm. To be judged by foreign law on ancestral land was an insult that cut deeper than territorial loss. Wamsuta felt the humiliation. Personally, certainly when he was summoned to Plymouth under suspicion of plotting against the colony. Though he went peacefully, the journey felt like walking into a cage. He returned ill, weakened, and died shortly after an event that sent shockwaves through Soames and beyond. Grief transformed into something darker. Metacom, now sachem, carried not only leadership but suspicion. Many whispered that Wamsuter's death had not been natural. Whether poison or stress, whether deliberate or incidental, the effect was the same. Trust fractured. The English denied wrongdoing, insisting on their innocence, but denial could not erase perception. Metacom felt the alliance bending toward collapse, like a bow drawn too tightly. He remembered the first ships and the fragile men who stepped ashore. He wondered how quickly weakness had turned into dominance. Sassaman sensed that a threshold had been crossed. The language of cooperation had grown brittle, strained by mistrust. He still believed war could be avoided, but his conviction was no longer steady. He felt watched by both sides, his loyalty measured in glances and silence. When he spoke caution to Metacom, urging restraint, he saw doubt flicker in the sachem's eyes. The space between them widened not in hostility, but in worldview. One still clung to diplomacy. The other began preparing for inevitability. By late summer, the forests seemed quieter, as though even birds sensed the tightening air. Meetings between colonists and Wampanoag leaders grew shorter, less cordial. Each side interpreted the other's caution as threat. Small disputes over livestock or trespassing now carried echoes of larger conflict. The alliance forged in desperation decades earlier was unraveling thread by thread. No musket had fired yet, no village burned. But the psychological ground had shifted irrevocably. Trust, once offered as protection, had become a vulnerability neither side fully understood until it was already too late. Autumn arrived with a copper glow over the forests surrounding Mount Hope, and the leaves fell like quiet warnings no one wanted to interpret. The wind carried the scent of drying corn and distant wood smoke from English hearths multiplying along the coastline. Metacom, now called King Philip by the colonists, walked the ridgelines overlooking his homeland, and felt the weight of inheritance pressing against his chest. He did not resent his father's alliance. He understood its necessity. But necessity, he was beginning to realize, is not the same as permanence. What had once been strategy now felt like surrender, disguised as patience. The event that hardened his doubt into something sharper was the death of Swam, found beneath the ice of Assawamsett Pond in 1675. His body carried more than silence, it carried accusation. Sassaman had warned the English that Metacom might be preparing for war, and soon after he was dead. 3 Wampanoag men were arrested, tried in an English court, and executed by hanging. To the colonists, it was justice served under law. To the Wampanoag, it was proof that English authority had extended beyond tolerance into dominance. Metacom felt the verdict like a blade pressed against his throat. If they could judge his people by their law, then the alliance had already ended in all but name. In the villages near Soames, anger spread faster than rumor. Young warriors sharpened hatchets, not only in preparation, but in frustration. They spoke openly now of reclaiming dignity through resistance. Metacom listened, torn between restraint and inevitability. He remembered the starving settlers of 1621, the fragile prayers in Plymouth's crude wooden chapel. He asked himself whether war would erase his father's wisdom, more prove that wisdom had been exploited. Leadership, he discovered, was not about certainty. It was about choosing which fear to live with. Meanwhile, English settlements tightened their defences. Militia drills became more frequent in towns like Swansea and Rehoboth. Ministers preached vigilance, warning congregations of possible Indian uprisings. Words shaped perception, and perception shaped readiness. Metacom understood that suspicion was no longer mutual, it was accelerating. Even gestures of neutrality were interpreted as threat. The fragile thread of communication that once connected leaders, now frayed. Under mutual distrust, it was no longer about land alone. It was about sovereignty, about who held the right to define justice. When the first shots rang out near Swansea in June 1675, they did not echo as isolated violence, they resonated as confirmation. Homes were attacked, livestock slaughtered. Colonial retaliation followed swiftly and brutally. Villages were burned in response, regardless of individual guilt. Metacom felt the line between defense and vengeance blur almost instantly. What began as assertion of autonomy became entangled in chaos. He had hoped to contain conflict, to strike with precision if necessary. Instead, the region spiraled into open war, dragging in neighboring tribes and colonies. Sassaman's absence haunted the unfolding crisis. Metacom remembered their debates, one urging caution through diplomacy, the other warning that patience could become submission. Now, the mediator was gone, and misunderstanding filled The void Metacom wondered whether Sassaman had misjudged him or whether he himself had misjudged the English capacity for control. There was no answer left to seek, only consequence. Each village that burned seemed to erase not just property, but memory. If this story feels heavier now, pause for a moment. These were not distant figures carved in myth, they were human beings making impossible decisions under pressure. If you value stories that confront history without softening it, consider supporting the channel with a like. Not as interruption, but as acknowledgement that these voices deserve to be heard beyond silence. Because what was unfolding in 1675 would not remain contained to one tribe or one colony. It would reshape New England itself. By late summer, the war had expanded across Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and into parts of Connecticut. English forces, bolstered by allied native groups, struck back with organized campaigns. Entire settlements on both sides were destroyed. Metacom watched smoke rise where forests once stood untouched, and he understood with chilling clarity that trust had not merely failed, had been weaponized. The alliance his father forged to preserve survival had ultimately provided the English with time, knowledge, and foothold. And now, that foothold was tightening like a fist around everything the Wampanoag had tried to protect. Winter closed in early over southern New England, and the forests around Narragansett Bay turned from copper to iron. Snow settled thick along the frozen edges of the Potset River, muting sound but not fear. Metacom moved constantly now, rarely sleeping in the same place twice. What had begun as coordinated resistance was unraveling under the pressure of colonial retaliation. English militias, hardened by months of skirmishes, had adopted brutal efficiency. They no longer distinguished between warriors and families with care. Villages suspected of harboring allies were burned to ash. Survival had become movement, and movement had become exhaustion. The Great Swamp Fight of December 1675 marked a turning point that felt like a wound carved into the land itself. Colonial forces marched through deep snow and attacked a fortified Narragansett village hidden within the frozen swamp of present-day South Kingstown, Rhode Island. Metacom was not present at the moment of assault, but the aftermath reached him swiftly. Hundreds dead, homes destroyed, food stores consumed by flame in the dead of winter. He understood the calculation immediately. Destroy the shelter, destroy the winter provisions, and you destroy the will to continue. The English were no longer reacting, they were dismantling. Wampanoag families fled through icy forests, carrying children wrapped in furs, stiffened by frost. Hunger replaced strategy as the dominant thought in many minds. Metacom watched warriors argue not about honor, but about food and safety. He felt leadership slipping into something darker, commanding men who were no longer fueled by hope of victory, but by desperation. He remembered his father's choice decades earlier to ally for survival. Now survival demanded war, yet war was steadily draining the very strength it required. English settlements also suffered. Frontier towns like Lancaster and Medfield endured devastating raids. Homes burned and lives lost. Colonial fear hardened into fury. Sermons framed the conflict as divine testing, casting Metacom as a symbol of treachery rather than a leader defending autonomy. Words became weapons that justified escalation. Metacom heard of these sermons through scouts and captives, and he felt the bitterness of misrepresentation settle deep within him. In their narrative, trust had been betrayed by the Wampanoag. In his, trust had been consumed by expansion. Sassaman's memory resurfaced often in Metacom's mind during these months of relentless cold. He wondered if mediation had ever truly been possible, once demographic imbalance tipped in the English favor. The colonists had grown in number and infrastructure, while the Wampanoag population, weakened by earlier epidemics, could not replenish at the same pace. The arithmetic of survival had shifted irreversibly. Metacom's internal conflict sharpened. Was resistance noble if it led to annihilation? Was submission survivable if it erased identity? Neither answer offered peace. Colonial forces began recruiting allied native groups more aggressively, fracturing long-standing relationships between tribes. Some sided with the English out of rivalry or pragmatism. Others sought neutrality and found it impossible to maintain. The war was no longer a single line of confrontation. It was a web of alliances and betrayals stretching across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Metacom saw clearly now how the original alliance with Plymouth had introduced dependency and proximity that made this fragmentation possible. Trust had opened doors not just to coexistence, but to strategic vulnerability. By early 1676, supply lines for Wampanoag fighters had thinned to almost nothing. Winter starvation accomplished what musket fire alone could not. Metacom moved toward the wooded refuges near Mount Hope, hoping to regroup, to salvage something from the collapsing resistance. Each step felt heavier than the last. He could sense morale fading, hear it in the quieter conversations, see it in the hollow eyes of warriors who had once spoken of reclaiming dignity. Leadership now meant guiding people through loss rather than toward victory. And yet, even in the bleakest cold, Metacom refused surrender. He understood what surrender would symbolize, not merely defeat, but confirmation that Wampanoag sovereignty could be overridden by foreign law and force. As snow melted into muddy thaw, the war did not cool, it intensified. English patrols tightened their search. Bounties were whispered. Betrayal became a currency more valuable than loyalty. The forests that had once provided concealment began to feel like narrowing corridors, and Metacom sensed that the final stage of this conflict was approaching, not as a dramatic charge, but as a tightening circle he could no longer outrun. Spring of 1676 did not bring renewal to the lands around Mount Hope. It brought pursuit. The thaw exposed blackened earth where villages once stood, and rivers carried fragments of charred timber downstream toward Narragansett Bay. Metacom moved through familiar woods that no longer felt protective. English patrols, guided by Allied scouts and driven by mounting desperation to end the war, closed in from multiple directions. The geography that had once sustained the Wampanoag-dense forests, tidal marshes, winding inlets now, became a maze tightening around them. Each path held the possibility of ambush, each clearing the risk of betrayal. Food was scarce. Families who had survived winter starvation now faced the collapse of organized resistance. Some leaders urged surrender, believing captivity might preserve at least fragments of their people. Others argued that surrender meant enslavement or execution. Metacom listened to these debates in the shadows of oak groves overlooking Mount Hope Bay, his mind torn between pride and responsibility. He felt the unbearable tension of knowing that every decision carried irreversible cost. Leadership had narrowed into a brutal equation. How many lives could be saved, and at what price to dignity? English authorities, emboldened by recent victories, issued proclamations promising clemency to those who abandoned Metacom. Bounties were placed on key leaders. Trust within Wampanoag ranks began to erode under the pressure. Suspicion replaced solidarity. Metacom sensed glances lingering longer than before, conversations stopping when he approached. He did not blame them. War strips certainty from even the most loyal hearts. But he understood that the alliance with Plymouth, decades earlier, had created channels of communication the English now exploited. Knowledge of terrain, of kinship ties, of leadership structures, all had been learned during years of supposed peace. In early August, colonial forces intensified their search around Bristol and the peninsula of Mount Hope. Skirmishes erupted in pockets, brief and violent. Metacom's circle shrank. He remembered standing on these same ridgelines as a younger man, debating strategy with Sassomin, arguing over the limits of diplomacy. Now Sassomin was gone, Wamsuta was gone, and his father's alliance lay in ashes. The irony pressed against him like a physical weight. Trust had granted the English time to grow strong. Resistance had granted them justification to destroy. A moment of emotional stillness arrived one evening as Metacom watched the sunset over the bay. The water glowed with a deceptive calm, reflecting pink and gold hues that masked the devastation beneath. He thought of his children, of elders who once spoke of coexistence, of the fragile optimism that had defined the early years of contact. If this story resonates with you, if you feel the quiet tragedy unfolding, long before the final blow, consider supporting the channel with a like. Not as distraction, but as recognition that history's silence deserves to be broken thoughtfully. Days later, betrayal crystallized what exhaustion had prepared. A Wampanoag man, named John Alderman, aligned with colonial forces, guided English captain Benjamin Church toward Metacom's hiding place near Mount Hope. The approach was calculated, deliberate. At dawn, on August 12, 1676, shots rang out through the humid air. Metacom was struck and fell among the underbrush of his ancestral land. The pursuit that had consumed New England for over a year ended not with negotiation, but with gunfire echoing across the peninsula. His body was treated not as that of a fallen leader, but as a warning. He was beheaded. His head later displayed in Plymouth for years as a symbol of colonial victory. The brutality carried a message unmistakable in its intent. Resistance would not be remembered with honor, but with humiliation. For the Wampanoag, the sight, or even the knowledge of, that display cut deeper than death itself. It signaled not just defeat in battle, but the erasure of sovereignty in public view. As news spread through scattered survivors, grief mingled with numbness. Some were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. Others were absorbed into neighboring tribes or forced into praying towns under English supervision. The war that began as defensive autonomy concluded in fragmentation. Mount Hope, once a center of Wampanoag identity, now stood under colonial control. The forests remained, the tides continued their rhythm, but the balance that Massasoit once sought through alliance had collapsed entirely. Trust, given in desperation decades earlier, had culminated not in shared survival but in irreversible loss. The war may have ended in August of 1676, but its consequences did not fall silent with Metacom's death. They settled slowly across New England, embedding themselves in policy, memory, and fear. In Plymouth, his severed head remained displayed on a pike for nearly 2 decades, a grim reminder to both colonists and surviving native peoples of what defiance would bring. For the English, it symbolized security restored. For the Wampanoag, it symbolized something far more permanent, the public execution of sovereignty itself. The alliance forged in 1621 had not merely failed, it had transformed into the mechanism of their subjugation. Survivors scattered, some were captured and sold into slavery in Bermuda and the Caribbean, torn from the forests and tidal marshes that had shaped their identity. Others were forced into praying towns, Christian settlements, where they were monitored under colonial supervision, their movements restricted, their traditions discouraged or forbidden. Families were fractured, names were altered in English records, language began to erode under pressure. The loss was not only territorial, it was cultural, spiritual, and generational. Trust, once extended to preserve existence, had paved the way for containment. For those who remained near Narragansett Bay and the lands around Mount Hope, daily life continued under the shadow of defeat. English farms expanded across former Wampanoag planting fields. Livestock grazed where sacred gatherings once took place. Children grew up hearing stories of a time before fences, before courts that judged them foreign on their own land. Elders spoke carefully, preserving memory in whispers rather than proclamations. The psychological toll lingered like an ache that never fully healed. Defeat was not just military, it reshaped identity itself. In colonial settlements, the war hardened attitudes permanently. Ministers interpreted victory as divine validation. Militias, once temporary formations, evolved into institutional defense structures. The memory of raids and burned towns fueled suspicion toward all native communities, even those who had remained neutral or allied with the English. What had begun as a fragile alliance between Massasoit and Plymouth now crystallized into a hierarchy enforced by law and arms. Coexistence gave way to control. The English no longer negotiated from vulnerability, they governed from dominance. Yet, within Wampanoag communities, resilience flickered quietly. Oral histories preserved names like Alsamequin, Wamsuta, and Metacom as villains, but as leaders navigating impossible circumstances. Some families maintained ceremonies in secret. Others blended adaptation with quiet preservation, refusing total erasure. The land itself carried memory in ways documents could not. Rivers still flowed past ancient shell. Middens, oak groves still marked places of council. Even under colonial authority, geography retained a kind of testimony. If this chapter feels heavy, pause for a moment. The tragedy here is not confined to one battle or one execution. It is about how trust, once offered in strategic hope, can be transformed by imbalance into leverage and control. If you value stories that explore the emotional depth behind historical events, consider subscribing so these layered narratives continue to reach beyond silence. Because what happened after 1676 shaped centuries of policy, perception, and power across North America. English expansion accelerated after the war, with organized native resistance weakened, settlements pushed further inland, new towns formed, new charters granted. The demographic balance shifted irreversibly. The Wampanoag Confederacy, once a regional power along the southern coast of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, was fragmented into smaller, monitored communities. The war had not just ended an alliance, it had redefined the political landscape of New England. And in the quiet aftermath, the cruelest realization emerged. The original decision to trust had not been foolish. It had been rational under threat from rival tribes and declining population. Massasoit had chosen alliance to prevent annihilation. For decades, that choice brought stability. But history does not freeze. Power shifts. Populations grow. Intentions evolve. By the time the imbalance became undeniable, the foothold granted through trust had already become foundation. The price was not paid in a single moment. It accumulated over years, until tragedy felt less like surprise and more like inevitability unfolding. Years passed, but the psychological echo of the war refused to fade. Along the shores of Buzzards Bay and the inland paths near Lakeville, silence carried memory like an undertow. Wampanoag survivors learned to move through a landscape that still looked familiar, yet felt claim. English townships now stood where seasonal camps once gathered. Roads cut through forest corridors that had followed ancestral logic for generations. To colonial eyes, it was progress. To the Wampanoag, it was displacement layered so gradually that it almost disguised itself as normalcy. But normalcy built on loss is a fragile thing. Children born after 1676 grew up hearing fragments rather than full accounts. Elders chose their words carefully, aware that open resentment could invite scrutiny or punishment. Metacom's name survived in whispers, sometimes reshaped into legend, sometimes softened into cautionary tale. The trauma was not only in what happened, but in what could no longer be openly remembered. English authorities, confident in victory, promoted narratives of rebellion, suppressed, and order restored. Over time, those narratives hardened into textbooks, sermons, and public memory, while Wampanoag perspectives retreated into oral tradition. In Plymouth, the pike that once displayed Metacom's head eventually weathered and was taken down. But its symbolism endured long after the physical object vanished. The display had not only warned of resistance, it had redefined legitimacy. Authority now flowed one direction. The original Treaty of 1621, once a symbol of mutual survival, was reinterpreted as the first step in colonial ascendancy. Trust, once framed as alliance, became retrospectively recast as inevitability. History, shaped by those who wrote it, rarely included the internal doubts, the fragile hopes, or the ethical calculations that had guided Massasoit's original choice. Among surviving Wampanoag families, identity adapted without fully dissolving. Some adopted English names to navigate legal system. Others converted publicly while preserving private traditions. Communities, such as those that would later become the Mashpee Wampanoag, held onto land through persistence and negotiation across generations. Resilience did not look dramatic. It looked like survival in small increments. Yet beneath that resilience lingered the knowledge that the alliance meant to secure. Autonomy had ultimately facilitated control. The psychological wound was not just defeated, was the recognition that trust had been strategically used. English expansion continued westward, reshaping the political future of what would become the United States. King Philip's War, often minimized in popular memory, had been one of the deadliest conflicts per capita in American history. Entire towns were destroyed, native populations decimated, and colonial fear intensified into hardened ideology. The cost was shared in blood, but unequally preserved in narrative. As decades turned into centuries, the emotional complexity of the early alliance faded from mainstream accounts, replaced by simplified myths of cooperation, followed by inevitable conflict. If this reflection feels like a pause in the storm, it is intentional. Sometimes the most powerful part of tragedy is not the violence itself, but the aftermath, the way memory is shaped, silenced, or distorted. If you believe stories like this deserve nuance rather than simplification, consider subscribing to the channel. Not for spectacle, but for depth. Because understanding how trust transforms over time helps us see patterns that still echo today. By the early 18th century, the Wampanoag were no longer the dominant coastal confederacy they once had been. Their numbers were diminished, their territory fractured, their political autonomy constrained. Yet they were not erased. Survival became quiet resistance, preserving language where possible, safeguarding lineage, adapting without surrendering memory. The land around Mount Hope still held the imprint of footsteps long before English ships appeared. That continuity, subtle and persistent, challenged the finality the colonists had intended. And in that continuity lies the most unsettling realization. The tragedy was not simply that trust was broken. It was that trust had once been rational, compassionate, even strategic. It was born from the desire to avoid annihilation. But power, once imbalanced, does not remain neutral. It reshapes agreements into advantages, cooperation into leverage. The Wampanoag had trusted, not blindly, but thoughtfully, and in doing so, they had paid a price that echoed far beyond one generation, a price measured not only in lives lost, but in autonomy surrendered under the shadow of a decision made in hope. By the time the 18th century settled fully over coastal Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the visible scars of King Philip's War had faded into farmland and town squares. Yet, beneath those fields lay the memory of villages burned near Swansea, the blood-soaked marshes of South Kingstown, and the quiet shoreline of Mount Hope, where Metacom had fallen. English maps redrew the land with neat borders and property lines, but they could not erase what had happened there. The transformation was not only geographic, it was psychological. The original alliance between Massasoit and Plymouth had altered the course of both peoples forever. In English accounts, the narrative hardened into one of providence and survival. The war became proof of divine favor, reinforcing the belief that expansion was destiny. Schools taught simplified versions of the early alliance friendship at a harvest feast cooperate. Ion in a fragile colony, while compressing the later devastation into a brief chapter of rebellion. The emotional complexity of trust given under threat disappeared from official memory. Over time, the image of mutual gratitude overshadowed the imbalance that had grown slowly, almost invisibly, beneath it. For the Wampanoag history was carried differently. It lived in oral storytelling, in the repetition of names, Ozamekin, Wansuta, Methacon, spoken with both pride and grief. It lived in the memory of Sassaman's divided path, a symbol of how proximity to power can become perilous. The tribe endured, not as a dominant confederacy, but as a people adapting under constraint. Families remained along parts of Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard, quietly preserving lineage and ceremony despite centuries of pressure. Survival did not erase loss, it coexisted with it. The emotional inheritance of the war stretched across generations. Children grew into adults, shaped by caution. Leadership meant negotiation within systems no longer of their making. The English legal structures, once foreign, became unavoidable frameworks. Yet the land itself still remembered older rhythms, the tide pulling against the shores of Buzzards Bay, the wind bending grasses along the coast. Geography preserved continuity even when politics did not. The tragedy was not that the Wampanoag vanished. It was that their autonomy had been redefined by an imbalance seeded decades earlier. Looking back, the cruel irony remains impossible to ignore. Massasoit's decision in 1621 had been rational. His people had been weakened by epidemic disease, threatened by rival tribes, and confronted by armed newcomers. Alliance offered stability and time to recover. For decades, it worked. Peace endured longer than many would have predicted. But history is not static. The English population expanded rapidly, their world view rooted in ownership, and expansion gradually eclipsed the reciprocal nature of the original agreement. Trust did not fail overnight. It was absorbed into a structure that outgrew the balance it required. If you feel the weight of that realization, pause with it. This is not simply a story of betrayal. It is a study of how imbalance transforms in tension. If narratives like this help you see history beyond simplified myths, consider leaving a like. Not as interruption, but as quiet acknowledgement that these stories deserve careful reflection rather than erasure. Because understanding this arc from alliance to annihilation reveals patterns that echo far beyond 7th century New England. By the end of the century, English dominance in the region was undeniable. Colonial governments strengthened, trade networks expanded, and settlements pushed further inland. The Wampanoag remained but within boundaries drawn by others. The price of trust had been cumulative. Political sovereignty lost, land fragmented, cultural practices constrained, leaders executed or exiled. The head displayed in Plymouth had long since decayed, but its symbolism endured in the imbalance that followed. And yet, despite the tragedy, the story does not conclude in silence. The Wampanoag still exist. Their descendants still speak, organize, and reclaim memory. But the cost remains etched into the historical landscape. The alliance that began with compassion on a cold shoreline of Cape Cod Bay ended in public execution and cultural fracture. Trust, offered in hope of shared survival, became the foundation of conquest. And that is the most haunting truth of all. Sometimes the most devastating consequences are born not from hatred, but from a decision made in hope before anyone can see how far its shadow will reach. In the end, the tragedy did not erupt in a single catastrophic moment. It unfolded slowly, almost quietly, across decades. It began on the cold shoreline of Cape Cod Bay, where weakened English settlers stepped onto unfamiliar sand, and were met not with immediate violence, but with calculation and compassion. Osamequin, known to the English as Massasoit, chose alliance, not out of naivety, but out of strategy. His people had survived epidemic devastation and regional instability. Trust was not weakness. It was a deliberate act meant to preserve life. And for a time, it worked. Peace held. trade flourished. Coexistence seemed possible, but power shifts rarely announced themselves with clarity. As Plymouth grew into a network of expanding settlements across Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the arithmetic of survival changed. What had once been mutual dependence became imbalance. Written laws replaced oral agreements. English courts asserted authority over native lives. Land, once shared through relational understanding, was measured, fenced, and owned. The alliance that had stabilized a fragile moment in history gradually became the foundation upon which colonial dominance was built. Trust did not collapse overnight. It was absorbed, reshaped, and leveraged. Metacom, called King Philip by his enemies, did not inherit a simple choice between peace and war. He inherited a narrowing corridor. His brother Wamsuta's death deepened suspicion. Sassaman's execution shattered mediation. The Great Swamp Fight and the relentless campaigns that followed transformed resistance into catastrophe. By the time gunfire echoed across Mount Hope in August 1676, the war's outcome had already been sealed by years of demographic expansion and structural control. His death was not the beginning of loss, it was the culmination of it. The English displayed his severed head in Plymouth as a symbol of triumph. It stood there for years, a public reminder that resistance would be crushed, but what it truly represented was more complex. It marked the end of a political balance that had once seemed sustainable. It marked the transformation of alliance into subjugation. And it marked the moment when trust, given in rational hope, revealed its long shadow. The Wampanoag did not vanish, but their sovereignty was fractured, their territory fragmented, their future constrained by systems they had not created. If you have followed this story from the first fragile handshake to the final gunshot, you have witnessed something deeper than a war. You have seen how compassion can coexist with strategy, how hope can coexist with fear, and how imbalance can quietly convert partnership into dominance. If this kind of layered storytelling resonates with you, consider subscribing and supporting the channel. These histories deserve space, not as simplified myths, but as human narratives shaped by difficult choices. The most haunting truth remains this: the Wampanoag trusted them, not blindly, not foolishly. They trusted because the alternative seemed worse. They trusted because survival demanded it, and for decades that trust preserved peace. Yet in granting time, proximity, and knowledge, it also enabled transformation beyond their control. When the forests burned and Mount Hope fell silent, the price had already been accumulating for years. Today, the tides still move across Narragansett Bay, indifferent to treaties and wars long past. The land remembers in ways documents cannot. The descendants of the Wampanoag remain, carrying memory forward despite centuries of pressure. But the lesson carved into that 17th century shoreline endures. Sometimes the gravest losses are not born from open hostility, but from a fragile hope that cooperation will remain equal even as power quietly shifts beneath it. And once that balance tips, the cost is paid, not in a single moment, but across generations.